So this is lesson 7 in the Android learning path, and this lesson is all about your configuration data. So we've got the project open that we downloaded from our Buzztouch control panel. This is the Monterey Harbor project. This is not the project, the Android project that we worked on in the first few lessons in the Android learning path where we made a new project from scratch. This is the project that contains all the source code for our application, and we'll be working with this project for the rest of this learning path. So configuration data, what is the configuration data? What is this all about? So when you download a project from your control panel, it will come with a file called bt_config.txt, and in your Android project it'll be included in the assets folder. And the purpose of this file is to describe to the Android operating system and to your application lots of different things about how your application performs or behaves, I should say, how it looks, how the screens are laid out. So this data is quite a bit less complicated than it looks, but it can be intimidating for people who are not familiar with JSON object notation, JSON data. So what is JSON data? JSON data is just a format that we use to describe different pieces of information. So if you took the iOS learning path, this video is almost a duplicate of the configuration data in that video. The reason that we're repeating it in the Android learning path is because not everyone takes both learning paths. So let's explore what JSON data is. I'm going to open up a blank text file here, and we're going to ignore our project for a minute, and we're just going to work with the blank text file. And we're going to talk about JSON, JavaScript object notation. So JSON is just a format. It's just a way to organize information. And so JSON data is really nothing more than a list of objects or individual objects and arrays. So arrays in JSON are lists of other objects, and objects describe things. So we use objects to describe things, and we use arrays to list a bunch of different kinds of objects. So what's an object in JSON? So in JSON, the syntax is for an object we have an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace, and inside these curly braces we describe an object using properties. So we could, for example, describe a car, kind of the classic example. Let's make an object property called object type and set that to car. Then we might say something like color would be the property and the value could be green. And let's say engine would be the property and the value could be V8. So right here, this piece of information is called a JSON object, and it's very easy to understand. As a human, we can read this and we can say that, hey, this information here probably describes a car. And then we could make another one of these objects. I'll just copy this one and paste it below it. We could make another one of these objects, and it could be object type car and maybe color red and maybe engine V6. So the number of properties for each object is arbitrary. We can introduce another property called, how about doors? And maybe this car has 4 doors, and maybe this car has doors. Maybe this car has 2 doors, and maybe we made another car and it doesn't have any doors at all, so we could just leave that property out. So depending on what you're working with and depending on what you're describing, it can get pretty complicated, or it can remain pretty simple. So that's how we use objects. Another example of an object, maybe we want to describe object type. Maybe we want to describe a swimming pool. I think we use that example in the iOS learning path. So swimming pool, so we might want to say size, 50 feet. We might want to say depth, 6 feet, and on and on. And so we can describe just about anything we want using JSON objects. So an array in JSON is indicated with square brackets. So we have an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket. Sometimes they're on the same line, sometimes they're not. It just kind of depends. So inside these square brackets, we can paste, or in this case we'll be pasting, we can create additional pieces of information by adding them to our list, adding them to our array. And then you can see here that all we're doing is creating a list of objects. I'll make this a little bit easier to see. A list of objects inside the square brackets. In this case, all the objects in the list are of the same type. They're all cars. And that's common when you're dealing with JSON. You're not usually going to have an array of things of different types, like you wouldn't have a car, and then a swimming pool, and then a boat. You probably have a list of cars, and then another list of swimming pools, and another list of boats, for example. But the idea behind JSON is it's a pretty simple way to describe simple information, and it's a pretty simple way to describe complex information. So that's kind of your crash course on JSON. But let's go back to our BT configuration file that's included in our project and try to make sense out of what we just talked about. So this configuration file has 3 arrays, an array of BT themes, or a list of themes, an array of BT tabs, an array of BT screens. And I know these are arrays because we can see that we have an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket. We have an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket. We have an opening square bracket right here and a closing square bracket right there. So the tabs list, or the tabs array, is empty. The themes array has 1 theme in it, and the screens array has a long list of screens. Actually, it's not very long in this case. There's only a few, but it's a list of different objects. So this object begins with this closing, or that opening curly brace, and it ends with this closing curly brace. And then we start a new object, starts there, ends there. So really, the configuration data in your application describes lots of different behaviors and properties of your application, all within one file. So I'm going to jump back to our control panel, our online control panel, and we're going to look at the application configuration data for this application we're working with. So I'm going to choose the configuration data choice here, and this is going to load JSON data in this box. And the reason I'm showing you this is this data in this box is an exact copy of the data that was included in our project, this data here. So the reason that we show you this is you may end up making a change in your control panel somewhere, which would therefore change this configuration data. And you may need to replace this data in your project after downloading the source code. When you download the source code for your project from your control panel, the configuration data will exactly match the configuration data online. However, you might make a change to that data, and you may need to make that change in your downloaded project so that you don't have to re-download the entire source code file package again. So that's how the control panel shows you that configuration data, is you use the screen, the configuration data screen for each individual application. So let's explore this a little bit further, and I'm going to remove some of this data so that we can see how easy this is, or we can see how easy it is relatively. So I'm going to remove this screen, and I'll remove this screen, and I'll remove this screen, and what we'll do is we'll remove all the screens except the map. And what we have here is the configuration data for just the map. So you can see here that this item has an item, or this object has an item ID. It's a unique ID that describes this JSON object uniquely from all the other objects in the file. It has an item type, and in this case it's a screen map. It's got an item nickname, got a navigation bar title. It's got a lot of different properties. And then one of the properties, called child items, is actually an array. And I know that because I have an opening square bracket there. And at the end of this data, I'm just going to make some white space here for us so we can see it. And at the end of this data, we have another square bracket which is the closing square bracket for these child items. So the child items are part of this screen, and they describe the locations, the individual map locations on our map. So in this case, there's only one map location. If there were two map locations on our map, it would look something like this. We'd have another item. It would have its own unique ID, and it would probably have a different address because it's a different location on our map. Something like this. And we would have two items in this list of locations. So because we have two, we would have a comma after the first one, but not after the last one. So that's how JSON data is organized, and that's how our BT configuration file is organized. And really, all it is a list of screens, which will be very, very long in some applications, in some cases. A list of tabs, which will either be blank or have one or two. Normally, if you have a tabbed application, you'll have 5 tabs. If you have an application without tabs, you'll have none. And then you'll have a theme inside the themes array. Interestingly, you'll only have one theme in your themes array when you download your source code. Even though you have maybe more than one theme in your control panel, there's only going to be one theme in your source code. And the number of properties in this theme will vary. You'll always have an item ID, and you'll always have an item type of BT theme, but you might have a background color, you might have a nav bar color, stuff like that. You might not, right? It just depends on how you've set up your theme. So the theme will only be one item. And then above the themes, you'll have some properties as they relate to the application itself. And everything inside the BT items array, which starts here and ends here, is related to your application. And then everything, including the BT items, is kind of wrapped in a parent or master object called BT app config. So, to summarize this lesson, the application's main configuration data that comes from your Buzztouch control panel is called btconfig.txt. It's included in your project when you download your source code. It's available in your control panel anytime you want to look at it for your application. And it is organized in JSON data format, JavaScript object notation. And you can edit it with a normal text editor, and you can read it as a human, and it will make some sense if you just spend a little bit of time trying to understand how it's laid out.